From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. So I'm here with two of my amazing colleagues, Monet Ukwu-Borue and Kate Batchelder Odell. We're talking about the Senate races. Kate was just talking about one potential pickup opportunity for Republicans in Nevada. Another one that has looked a little better for Republicans, although I think it's still going to be tough, is Arizona. I'll just talk about that for a second. That's where sitting Democrat Mark Kelly, he's an astronaut. That has really helped him, by the way. If you see him, he really is playing big on his time in outer space. He's done a good job positioning himself as a defender of Arizona and willing to break with his party. Just last week, Kelly and his GOP opponent, Blake Masters, had a big debate. Let's listen to Kelly talk a little bit on that point about independence from his party.
I've been strong on border security, and I've stood up to Democrats when they're wrong on this issue.
It sounds like
including, by the way,
yes,
including the president. You know, when the president decided he was going to do something dumb on this and change the rules, you know, that would create a bigger crisis, you know, I told him he was wrong. So I pushed back on this administration multiple times, and I've got more money on the ground to increase Border Patrol staffing.
So a couple of interesting things about that clip. One is that Kelly feels the need to respond on border issues because that is probably where Blake Masters, the Republican, has been hitting them the most. Secondly, that's a pretty bold statement to essentially call a position that your own president made dumb. But that is how Kelly has been managing to stay ahead in this race. He's really run a bunch of ads saying, I've broken with my party on policing, I've broken with my party on the border, I've broken with my party on spending. If you dig into his record, it's really not as clear cut as that. Kelly is pretty much a loyal soldier, but his campaign is about suggesting that he's defending Arizona issues, kind of trying to put him in the same camp as his fellow Senator Kyrsten Sinema. And then on the other hand, you have Blake Masters. He came out of an absolute brutal primary where a lot of the other Republicans really roughed him up. It was looking so bad that the National Republican Senatorial Committee had last month signaled it was going to pare back its spending. But things have tightened in the last couple of weeks, and they now just announced that they're going to put in a new seven-figure investment in backing Masters. There's some private money flowing in for him as well, too. And that suggests the GOP still thinks this state might be winnable. Interesting, just I'd note this, another dynamic in all of these races. Some of that NRSC money is actually earmarked to go to Hispanic outreach, which is, I think, a comment on the effort the GOP is making this year to capitalize on what seems like a possible shift among minority voters more in Republican directions. Monet, this brings us to the other place that Republicans had really been banking on, but I would say has now become the hardest race out there, which is Georgia. Herschel Walker, football star, is challenging Raphael Warnock, who's only held that seat since last year. But last week, the Daily Beast reported that Walker had paid a woman to have an abortion. He strongly denied it, is still denying it. But subsequently, it ran a story saying she'd had a child with him. Now the New York Times has looked at court records that show Walker has paid that woman child maintenance. He hasn't said a lot about this part. What do you make of this story, and how much do you think it's going to hurt Republicans in this final stretch?
I think it has the potential to really hurt Republicans. I mean, Herschel Walker was already somewhat struggling in the polls compared with what you would expect from a nominee from the GOP in Georgia, what has been traditionally a red state, although Democrats have made inroads there over the past few years. Herschel Walker has a sort of somewhat troubled background to begin with in terms of his own mental health situation. I believe that he's struggled with bipolar disorder. And then also his family has accused him of basically being absent and in some instances even being threatening with them. And so that was already sort of public even before the race began. And then when the Daily Beast broke this story about him having paid for an abortion, which the New York Times now says that it has confirmed, I think that that took the controversy up a level in terms of a lot of conservative voters in the state being a little bit uncomfortable casting their votes for Walker. The polls still show that the race is, it's being contested. He still, I think, trails in the polling averages by maybe about 8 points or something like that. But the key is that Georgia is a runoff state. If Warnock isn't able to clear 50% on the first ballot, then they're going to potentially go to a runoff. And so I think that that's sort of the best hope for Republicans now. I think that in a potential runoff situation, it would give time for people to absorb the controversies around Walker and potentially just bring the stakes of the race to the foreground in terms of the other races will have been decided. Georgia voters might know that they are casting a vote for control of the Senate as opposed to just a vote for Herschel Walker. And so if you do have a lot of conservatives who are prioritizing making sure that the Senate is a check on Joe Biden's presidency, it's possible that they could end up coming home and circling the wagons around Walker in the end.
Yeah, and one interesting thing about that runoff that you mentioned, as you said, you got to get to 50%. And the libertarian in this race is Chase Oliver. And by some polling, he is actually taking about 4% of the vote. And a lot of the Republicans I talked to feel that if he were eliminated and they did go to a runoff, that some of those or a significant number of those votes would go over to Herschel Walker, and that is why they are very much, I think that is a strategy at this point to kind of just hope that they can get through to a runoff and then see what comes after that. So finally, I think this brings us to a couple of states where they're more of a real stretch for the GOP, but there's certainly some potential there if things went the right way. One of those, and I'm just going to throw it out and let you set it up there, Kate, is Colorado. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah, we have Michael Bennet defending his seat in Colorado, which should be, like you were saying, it's really a stretch for Odea is the Republican challenger's name. To take that seat, I mean, we saw Cory Gardner lose in Colorado in 2020, despite being a very strong candidate. Now, granted, the dynamics are different in a midterm year, but you would think that Bennett's seat is likely safe. Abortion has also been a major issue in that race, but in this case, the Republican candidate leans more towards pro-choice views and was bruised by that a little bit in the primary. So there's one question there of whether that depresses the base or whether that helps him with independence. It will be very interesting to see how that plays out. So I think that one is going to be a little bit of a stretch there. But, you never know, Kim. For instance, crime is another major issue in the state in Denver, and that could really play to Republicans' favor if they just see the disorder around them being just too much to tolerate. That could get them interested in a Republican candidate, especially if he is appearing to be more moderate. So that will be a very interesting state to watch, though I think Bennett probably hangs on. He has a wide name recognition in the state, well known, and he's managed to win his past races. So I think that's what we're likely to see there.
Yeah, it's so tough, and I feel bad for all of us, by the way, but also everyone who's listening, watching these, because the other big unknown in all of this is where are the polls? I mean, are they correct? Are they off by the margins that they were off last time around, which was really significant in some of these swing states? And so we just don't know how much that is playing into this as well either, in either direction. I think it makes people feel very uncertain. Monet, one more that I think is a stretch, although interestingly, strategists still seem really interested, is New Hampshire. Why don't you go through that one? We'll give you the last word here.
Well, New Hampshire was early on one of the states where Republicans were very hopeful of a potential pickup. Maggie Hassan, the candidate there, is basically a conventional liberal and has voted really reliably with President Biden, despite the fact that New Hampshire is historically a swing state and one that credible, polished, prepared Republican candidates have been able to win easily. And so the party hoped to recruit the governor, Chris Sununu. He declined, I think not wanting to drag himself through another brutal campaign, and fair enough. But I think that one of the pivotal moments in the race was obviously the nominating process among Republicans. They ended up going with Don Bolduc, who is a retired Army general. And in addition to being politically experienced, he's someone who had come out and very early on embraced not just former President Trump, but part of his brand was suggesting that the 2020 election had been fraudulent. And he actually signed a letter along with other top armed forces brass, basically alleging that that was true. Or I should say not top armed forces brass. I think it probably was a collection of lower ranking retired generals. But I think that that is something that's made him vulnerable in New Hampshire and probably has stopped him from gaining the support of some, upper class suburban voters in that state who would have been open to sending a Republican to Washington to fill that Senate seat and again put a check on President Biden. But he's found that he's kind of had a ceiling on his level of support. And frankly, he also has kind of flip-flopped on the question of election fraud after that. So after staking out this very very aggressive position, saying he thought the election was stolen. He completely backtracked on that recently on a Fox News appearance, saying that he had talked to people and been convinced that it wasn't. And so this flip-flopping on the issue is probably something that might even depress turnout that he could have gotten from the sort of more Trump-embracing wing of the party. And so you actually had the National Republican Senatorial Committee decide to cut their ad spend in that state. So they really were trying to see if they could make it happen. But now it seems as if the Republican establishment is coming close to giving up on that state and just thinking that's probably a seat that's going to remain in Democratic hands.
Yeah, candidate quality. That seems to be one of the big themes or problems for the GOP this year. And it would be interesting to see where everybody were if they had some nominees that weren't quite so contentious. One last thing I just note about all these races, it's funny having covered a lot of elections. A lot of times people get really excited about this stuff. The one thing that every Democrat and Republican I have talked to agrees is this is not fun this time. Everybody just describes it as a slog. They just want it to be over. And I think that's a comment on just how close everything is. Well, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Monet. We thank our listeners and remind you all that we are here every weekday. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button.